We are delighted to present Caste and Culture, the inaugural session of our theme on inclusion and diversity that runs through October and November. Today, we are also, for the first time, offering Indian Sign Language interpretation, and we hope to continue this service for all our online talks and events going forward. Well, museums have the potential to create meaningful experiences for people from all origins and backgrounds. At MAP, we believe that the arts and culture can and should play a positive role in social change. And a focus on inclusion and diversity in museums and cultural discourse is a very important part of that. Here, I would like to pause and thank the Emphasis F1 Foundation, one of our founding patrons and our accessibility partner. If today we are able to construct a museum building that will be truly accessible and design our programs in a way that removes all possible barriers so that everyone feels welcome at MAP, it is all thanks to Emphasis's financial support and guidance in helping us build an accessible and inclusive museum. Well, to get back to our program, we are very pleased to have two compelling speakers, T.M. Krishna and Suraj Yengade, join us this evening. A renowned Carnatic vocalist, T.M. Krishna is also in many ways a cultural anthropologist who writes and speaks about issues affecting the human condition, while exploring the contours of tradition, modernity, and hierarchies. Dr. Suraj Yengade is one of India's leading scholars on caste, race, and ethnicity studies. He also brings his own experience and a critical lens to bear upon matters of caste and culture, ranging from labor and literature to love. Their extended biographies will be posted on the chat box. You can share your questions for them via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So let's get on with it. Dr. Yengade, may I invite you to begin with a short presentation on your book, Caste Matters?
Thank you so very much, Kamini, for inviting me and my dear brother T.M. Krishna to be in conversation. Him and I, we're trying to get together at least for more than a year on some occasions, but we just couldn't. I really welcome this event. And also I would like to appreciate and give a shout out to your team, Shilpa in particular, and other colleagues who are here, and also Gaurav Verma, who so very kindly is offering his sign language interpretation. So appreciation to you too, dear brother. He has said thank you. I think that means I don't want to burdensome him more. Let's dive into the topic. I think today what we all want to know, I want you to know three phrases or keywords, if you will. The first is Brahmin. Well, you don't need to pay much attention. I guess many of them on this space and audience would be very much well versed. Some of them might come from the womb of a Brahmin mothers. Then you need to pay attention to the idea of courageous human beings. And third, which me and TM will engage in our second session, hopefully is, which I will bring, is the art of the polluted. And our themes are intersecting. Him and I spoke together at MIT a couple of years ago, and we've been wrestling with this question about how to present a nuanced as well as extremely important and ideal representation of art world, the histories, the submerged pasts, and so forth. But today, speaking about caste matters, I'll tell you a story. Somewhere in Pune, I will not name the location, in the early 20th century, there was a young man. His father was a huge leader of Indian movement, Indian independence movement. And he had a significant presence. His father was a scholar, an erudite critique, as well as a ardent nationalist of his own cause. Now, in the process of his fighting for the independence, this young man saw his father and, of course, wanted to grow up under his wings. But somehow on the way, he realized that his father is inadequate to support him. His father doesn't satisfy his progressive anchors. His father, even though a big leader, still has many, many poles to attend to. And those poles were people's mandates. I say polls as in Polls. And therefore, what this young man does is he tries to find out for people who are invested in the cause that he is interested in. And for this, he inaugurates a conversation on his part. He wants to look for people who believe in his cause. And so he travels to Mumbai from Pune. And when he comes to Mumbai, he tries to get an audience with the people who he appreciates. He wants to spend some time with them. But the people who he wants to meet are also quite busy. So he wants to make sure that his representation or his presence is noticed. But his father's name comes with a huge baggage, and sometimes it's not encouraging. However, determined, he still keeps revisiting Mumbai. And whenever he tries to go to an office of people who he admires, this person, very few people in history would know, because this person couldn't live longer. A tragedy befell on him and he died. He committed suicide. He jumped in front of a train, gave up his life, and wrote one letter. The content of letter I will read to you towards the end of this talk. Who is this guy? Sridhar Pant Lokmanya Tilak, or we can say Bal Gangadhar Tilak. Sridhar Pant is the son of the famous ardent Brahmin nationalist Lokmanya Tilak, or some people call him Bhatmanya, or approved by Brahmins Tilak. Now we all know that the phase of Tilak's life has been pretty interesting. He actually argues that Brahmins are the Aryans, somewhere living in Arctic. His book itself talks about it, and he's the one who is very blunt about his depositions to the British government. He doesn't want British regime to bring democracy to the working class, to the Shudras, and in fact, he doesn't want the oil pressers and the caste who are toiling to get into the parliament house, who can then dictate the lives of Brahmin, the supreme, the Ubermensch. Lokmanya Tilak is a very complicated person. But more interesting life of Tilak's is his two children, his two sons. One of them was, of course, Sridhar Pant Tilak. Sridhar Pant Tilak was an ardent anti-caste activist. He didn't believe in what his father stood, although they grew up in the same house. He didn't stood by the values that his father was propagating to the rest of India, where the rest of India was accepting, or at least paying significant attention to. Sridhar Pant then defies all those codes of a Brahmin male and does something extraordinary, which is to go and work under the leadership of the towering anti-caste scholar, intellectual of his time, Dr. Ambedkar. He wants to become the devotee of Ambedkar. That's why he goes to Mumbai, tries to get an audience with Ambedkar at his Social Service League office. When Ambedkar doesn't have time, doesn't give up, still keeps coming until Ambedkar notices. And of course, Ambedkar, being Ambedkar, welcomes him with open arms, and they spend some time. But Sridhar Pant is not satisfied. He wants to do something. And he wants to now create a momentum around that. How would he do it? He has a Kesari, a trust, of course, inherited of his father's, the Kesari newspaper. He tries to utilize that space to advocate for anti-caste movements so that they can have adequate space to express themselves. The Orthodox, or rather say the Brahmin members, reject and defile his move. Sridhar Pant tries again. And when there is a conference, just so happens that a conference is held in Pune of the Untouchables, Sridhar Pant emphasizes that the conference committee come and eat at his place in Gaikwad Wada in Pune. Gaikwad Wada is then the center of Sanatan Dharma space. It's Gaikwad Wada, his place, but of course known to the rest of Brahmin gentry about a location of Brahmin pride. How could untouchables come and consume food at a house of no less than the son of Bal Gangadhar Tilak? When he throws open this, offers a food, evening food is happening, and then he says, I want to go further ahead. I want to support actively. And of course, tries to gather funds and utilizes his cultural capital that he has to the service of liberation of the untouchables. And he does this consciously under the guidance of Ambedkar, or at least looking up to his leadership and what he's doing. Sridhar Pant couldn't, he keeps fighting with Kesari Trust over his ownership. And eventually, due to the crass and traumatic treatment given by his own Brahmin community, he goes to court. The case is running in court. The history is still there. And then something he couldn't take upon himself. He decides to give up his life because the Brahmins are not allowing him to live the life the way he wants. Sridhar Pant writes his last letter before committing suicide. I'll read that out for you. This is when the conservative circle, basically, of Kesari Maratha Trust, they took him to court for 7 years, and that's frustrating. He has to fight with his own people. And on 25 May 1928, Mumbai-Pune Express train is fast, and he jumps before the train. And he writes, "Before the letter reaches your hand, the news of my leaving the world would have reached your ears. In order to advance the work of your Samaj Samta Sangh, educated and social reformist youth need to be attracted to the movement. I am extremely delighted to see your persistent effort in this, and I'm confident that God will bless you with success. If the Maharashtrian youth take this cause, then the problem of untouchability will be resolved in merely 5 years." And this is poignant to convey the grievances of my depressed classes, brothers, to God Krishna. I am going ahead. Please convey my regards to friends. Sincerely, Sridhar Balwant Tilak. This is the final letter he writes to Ambedkar. Ambedkar is at a conference. Ambedkar receives this. Ambedkar is shocked. And Ambedkar, of course, pays a tribute to it. This is the fight of a courageous Brahmin whose story is not yet known, but we know the story of the wrongs. Thank you.
Thank you, Suraj. Can I go, Kamini? Or should I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much, Suraj, for that wonderful introduction to the ideas we're discussing today, and for that retelling. Thank you, Kamini, Shilpa, and Gaurav. Thank you all for doing all that you're doing to enable this conversation. And like Suraj said, we've been hoping to have conversations and more for a long time. Just not happened, and I do hope this is a beginning of many more such interactions. It'll be truly a pleasure. I'd like to begin with looking at two words. One word which is there in the theme of today's conversation, which is inclusion. And I think it's important that that word is problematized. The meaning of any word depends a lot also on where it is being uttered and who's uttering it. The meaning changes, and the changes in its inferences and its intrinsic quality is something we should be acutely aware of. So when I, a Brahmin, a male with every privilege, use the word inclusion, I should be very, very watchful of what it tells. Because inclusion can also be an act of violence, act of charity, an act of coming from immense privilege, but not out of respect and equality and the question of rights. That there is no favor being done here, that there is no sympathy, but this is something that is rightfully needs to be discussed and placed in this discourse. So I would rather see inclusion as the absence of every form of exclusion, rather than it be an act of including, especially if I am ever going to use that word. The other word very related to inclusion is the word location. And it's my location that I need to recognize when I'm having a conversation on caste. If I was having a conversation on gender, I have to recognize my male location. In caste, I have to recognize my caste privilege location, the location of having hundreds and hundreds of years of cultural and social privilege. And that's going to continue all through my life, irrespective of the fact that I may be fighting against it. And I begin here because Sebastian and Sons poses this fundamental question of my location and me being the person who's enabling this conversation or this sharing of knowledge of people's lives and experiences. And of course, my own interpretation of what I see, observe, and learn from. So it is a complicated relationship, and it is something that I put out without giving you an answer to the complexity, but recognizing the complexity of this, and as much as I do when I write the book itself. I'm also going to tell you a story of people you don't know. To give you a landscape, the world of Carnatic music, or the world of Hindustani music for that matter, has been heralded as symbols of Indian culture. I'd like to begin by fundamentally saying that very notion is problematic. And behind those notions are words like classical, Shastriya Sangeet, folk music. You may use a Sanskrit word, use a Marathi word, use a Hindi word or a Tamil word, but the positionality of those expressions and what they infer are deeply problematic. And as a person in music and in art, I can quite confidently say that the words classical and the word folk have no aesthetic quality to them. They are purely socio-political expression which are discriminative intrinsically in their being. Therefore, the first thing I would like to do is throw them into the dustbin. Who are these people? Who is Sebastian? And who is Sebastian's Sons? Anybody who has seen Carnatic music performed would have seen the instrument mridangam, or even seen devotional music, the mridang. And the mridangam and styles of playing have connections to the Maharashtra tradition, the Marathi tradition. And I won't go into the history of that, but it's a very important link and connection of this whole tradition of playing the mridangam. There are great musicians who have played the mridangam, great artists alive and in the past. 99% of them are Brahmins. A few belong to another caste group called the Isevelalas. Isevelalas and the Brahmins, but it is the Brahmins who have dominated this profession. But who makes that instrument? Who gives the Brahmin mridangist that magnificent sound? Who is the technologist? Who is the innovator behind? Who is the person who has carried forward traditions of bringing that magic to a form that allows the Brahmin mridangist to say, wow, I can create magic. And for us in the audience to say, aha, not for a moment thinking about where did the sound actually come from. Sebastian is probably the first or the earliest mridangam maker I have been able to locate in the tradition of mridangam making. It is believed that the modern mridangam making technique came along with the Naradiya tradition, that is a Bhakti Sangeet tradition, a Brahminical tradition, a Brahmin tradition that came from Maharashtra during the Maratha rules of Tanjore. All the Brahmins have always said Tamil culture, great music comes from Tanjore, and we always wonder why. That's because the population and the concentration of Brahmins in that district was very high. And what they proclaimed as high art is accepted as high art. Everything else remains in the fringes or forgotten. But even within this high art, we are talking about intra-art. It is the Brahmin who decides what is to be recognized and what is not to be recognized. And in this comes caste. Most of the mridangam makers are Dalits. And many of them, especially one family from Tanjavur, are Christian Dalits. They have made the mridangam for about 7 generations, and in that one family, I have traced about 35, 40 makers now. Now, nobody knows them. Nobody knows what they do. Let me add another layer of discrimination in this. The discrimination also is accentuated by the fact that you need skin to make the mridangam. The mridangam uses 3 kinds of skin. The most important and very carefully selected, if I may add, is the cow skin. The second is the goat skin, and the third is the buffalo skin. Till today, mridangam artists will claim that the cow skin is just taken from cows that are either naturally dead or that they are anyway being killed for meat. Both these are frauds. Because if you want a skin to be used for the mridangam maker has to select the cow, select special breeds of the cow, and cut specific parts of the skin from the body of the cow to use it. An old, naturally dead cow skin cannot be used. So therefore, the animal is killed specifically to be used for the mridangam, played by the Brahmin mridangists, who will proclaim that vegetarianism is the greatest thing that we could ever find. I hope you noticed the great disturbance in this entire set of statements I have made. And in order to retain his purity and the purity of this so-called high art, he needs the mridangam maker, the Dalit mridangam maker. Like one mridangam maker told me, and he said it in a fashion that was very disturbing. He said, we are in between the abattoir, that is where the gore and the blood and the skin is taken, the flesh is removed, it's cleaned, the smell is taken away, and the skin has to transform to an element of an instrument, right? So he said, we are the people in between the gore of what we need to do and that divinity of a mridangam that the Brahmin mridangist wants. If you take us away, you can never get the mridangam. You can never get that transference from the notion of impurity to the notion of purity, from the notion of something that is niche to something that is divine. This is the ugly, complicated world of Mridangam playing and Mridangam making. And there is another aspect to this that I will highlight before we can begin a conversation. Is this idea of also knowledge in this. The knowledge of the Mridangam maker. First of all, Mridangam maker is never recognized as an individual or as an independent being, as a mind. His work is taken as labor. This is not just something that you find in the making of instrument. And there is a difference between making a veena and making a Mridangam. Let me tell you that. Because for two reasons. One, veena doesn't use hide. Therefore, the caste differential between the veena maker and the Brahmin veena player is less. But the Mridangam is made out of hide. And therefore, it is primarily the Dalit community that is doing it. But never is the families that have made the instrument being credited for the innovation and for their mind and for the way they bring abstract concepts into actual physical possibilities. The Mridangam player may say, I want this kind of sound. He doesn't know, he doesn't have the intellectual equipment actually to express what he wants. The person who has intellectual equipment to understand a vague term like the sound is not round enough. But make sure that that roundness is a physical quality is the Mridangam maker. But never is the Mridangam maker acknowledged as this because his work is taken as labor. So who creates this idea of knowledge? How is knowledge valued? When is something knowledge? When you distance something from a physical happening, from the bodily to something that is in the mind or beyond, you also are playing the game of caste. Because you would find in any society, especially Indian society, that as we consider something more and more intellectual, as we create this false notions, we are creating it sociologically and politically and not actually through the engagement of ideas. And therefore, this is not just a Mridangam making. I can tell you, there's this great artist who performs his art form called Kutte. And he's the one who said this to me and it shook me. He said, you know, what we do is labor. And I thought to myself, have I ever said my work is labor? I have never used that word. Of course, I too practice for hours and hours. There is physical practice, but I wouldn't call it labor. My work somehow is divine, is intellectual. It is something beyond the body. But here is an artist who said his is labor, and that was fundamentally an expression of the caste dynamics that was in play, not got to do with what we were actually doing. So the Mridangam maker is marginalized within the world, within the world of high art. He is not seen, he is not heard, he is not recognized, he is impure, and he has to remain in that realm for the Brahmin to continue enabling his own storytelling of the divinity of his art form, of the divine that the audience experiences, that they sense this delusionary notion of purity. And this is the ugly relationship, also complex relationship. The thing is that the Mridangam maker and the Mridangam player are in constant contact with each other because the Mridangam needs constant repair, change of skin, retuning, etc., etc. So that relationship then is completely muddled in caste dynamics. It's changed through the years. Each generation are having different discourses, but that it still exists, unspoken, non-discussed, many times normalized, is a fact. A final point is that the Mridangam maker is in a more complicated situation than many others. Because not only is his workplace a space of Brahmins, his cultural space has also become that. So to a large extent, you find that the Dalit Mridangam maker is not in a way part of the larger Ambedkarite discourse or the Dalit discourse that you have seen in India today. So there is an isolation within an isolation because the cultural environment of the family is only here. And the ugliness of caste as being oppressive from top, as being oppressive intellectually and emotionally because you've created an ugly aspirational model, and the bandwidth that also constricts from sides makes it a very, very, very difficult position for Mridangam makers to be. I have spoken about intra-caste, but exactly everything I've said is applicable to inter-caste. I've spoken about intra-art form, correction. And it's as applicable to inter-art forms. I'll end by what Thol Tirumavalavan, who came for the launch of the book, said. And it is a very pertinent statement. He said, when I read this book and I saw what status the Mridangam is in the world of this, within quotes, great art form, Carnatic music, I thought to myself, if this is the situation of the Mridangam, what would be the situation of the Parai? And for those who don't know what the Parai is a hide-based rhythmic instrument made and played by Dalits. Thank you very much.
Suraj, can we invite you to come on as well now?
Suraj, you're muted. Yep.
Thank you so much, Krishna, for that sharing. We've been discussing about this for some time, and I'm just so glad the book is out for in its form and its shape. And I also would like to extend my appreciation to this book. I have that book, and one aspect I think Krishna, we should bounce off is how the differentiation with the origin of art form, the way we see. For example, I grew up thinking jazz was a white American music.
Yeah.
I grew up thinking rock and roll or blues was a white American music.
Correct.
In fact, I took a class here at Harvard on the history of art, where the quote-unquote classical art forms, Mozart, and of course the Austrian state art that was developed had African influences, which is we don't know, but when that came to my discovery, and then of course there was a very interesting distillation of that.
Your voice is not clear. Your voice is not clear, please.
My voice is not clear. Okay.
Now it's better. Just come a little closer. Yeah.
I'll come closer. Thank you, Gaurav, for that. So I was when that history of this art form, or at least the musical form, front, I was very awestruck to look at my own status, which is in India.
Just come closer, Suraj. Your voice is disappearing a bit somehow. I don't know. It was fine the last round. Yeah.
Maybe I might use the earphone.
No, that's fine. That's fine. As long as you have the mic on it, you can. It may be easier.
I think I'll just use the.
Yeah, sure.
As I'm plugging this, what I wanted to really talk about is how then are there any Dalit or outcast origin for the Indian quote-unquote classical musical?
So, okay. One simple answer first would be, to my knowledge, Suraj, the so-called classical forms have never been a Catholic form where everybody has participated.
That's right.
It has always been an exclusive fiefdom. There has been what you could call a bandwidth elasticity a little bit. I'm talking about a social elasticity. But have Dalits really participated in the making and appreciation of these art forms? To my knowledge, the answer is actually no. Because they have been very tightly held by caste privilege, especially the Brahmin community. And this is as true of Hindustani music as it is true of Carnatic music. It just operates with a different set of caste rules there compared to this. That's it. But if you look at one more thing, right? This idea you brought out by saying, like, when you thought, for example, that jazz was a white art form, or rock and roll for that matter, right? Absolutely. Now in India we do another very ugly business, that we think that we think that anything that is practiced by the Bahujan community, art forms, and it could be ritual, it could be anything, is made better. The evolution of it is actually done by us. So what we do is, we actually make it even worse in the discourse. So there's no respect of the art forms that are there practiced by multiple communities. So if those art forms need respect, both visually, aesthetically, and in experience, they have to be handled by this community or a couple of communities who then make it more sophisticated, create more subtlety, and what is ethnic and rural and rough becomes a polished diamond. So we actually do something that's even more vulgar, in my opinion, in this discourse. And caste is at the center of this vulgarity, without any doubt.
To advance that thought, same happens in the performance arts, mostly the classical dance forms.
Yes.
And a colleague of mine, herself a Brahmin from Andhra Pradesh, uncovered in her research about the origins of Bharatnatyam being essentially a Dalit art form, and how it is actually, first of all, it is relegated to the vulgarity or eroticism, because when a Dalit woman performs, her body and her art form is considered, is meant to be an art form of the of the outcast, but also outcast women.
Yeah.
And then what we see especially in Tamasha. Tamasha is an art form of, in Maharashtra, which I am particularly aware of, very much, rural, people-centric. There is even in Tamasha a critique of the patil or the landlord, and it's a performative jest. And people, that was the, that's the basically Beatles performing in the 1960s, with huge crowd equivalent of that.
Yeah.
But then, the women who were performing in Tamasha were Dalit women, and their stories are very much of, being sexually exploited by the person, because Tamasha was always considered a space of, vulgar, and the Brahmins would say that's the dirty art form. But somehow in the past 15 years, we have seen there is in a way, Brahmin ownership of Tamasha, and now it has suddenly become a high art form.
Exactly.
That
appropriation, yeah.
Exactly. And so what happens is, heretofore, they were women folks from the Dalit community who were amazing, my God, amazing international tamasha or lavani performers for their art form. But they were never given a status, as what you say, of an artist. And a tag of artist was only given when a light-skinned Brahmin woman from a very particular Brahmin subcaste performs into this. So my, one thing I would like to, for you to maybe perhaps help us reflect also on how the intra-caste, especially among Brahmins, dynamics work. Are there specific Brahmins performing or doing particular form of music or any form of art, or is it more like universal for any Brahmin doing anything?
Okay.
Because in the Dalit community, we have a specific subcaste also doing this, just to.
So even technically, if Brahmins really want to talk about caste, none of the Brahmins should be performers. Okay, they have no business being artists at all, if they were really going to talk about caste. So actually, within the Brahmin community, to my knowledge, there is no division of art form per se by subcaste. Okay, it's an ownership by the entire identity. Okay. And in that, the thing is, if you can ask me, what's the percentage of Brahmins who love these art forms? It's probably going to be quite limited. Okay. But the nicheness is what makes it a prized location. So therefore, if you're a Brahmin, and even if you hate it, you're never going to disrespect this art form. You're going to still say it is part of my culture, this notion of my culture. And you're going to protect it. You're going to protect it by caste. You're going to protect it by religion. You're going to still push people away and say, this still belongs to my community, even if I don't understand head or tail of what it is. This is very similar to how Brahmins still will celebrate rituals, even if they don't participate in any ritual. It is a cultural, intellectual, and a casteist need to hold that close, to establish that power equation in the larger dynamic of society. And that's exactly what is done. Actually, there's not very much of a difference between how Brahmins treat these art forms and think of ritual. It is as close. I mean, it's not different from how they wear the Jenu. It's exactly that. Even Brahmins who are so-called, within quotes, techies, modern, who will not do actual pujas which are connected to it, still find ownership in wearing that thread. And you ask them why, they just say, this is my identity. Carnatic music is like that. It's a caste ownership. And that is why it is held so tight. And it is held by the entire community. But you made another observation which I want to, also the idea of the body, especially when you spoke about, right? That is also very important. You take Bharatanatyam. Till the early 20th century, it was the Isai Velalar community who were dancing Bharatanatyam. Many of them were from Devadasi heritage, from courtesan heritage, and very soon, because of a lot of political movements and of course the anti-Nach movement, etc., they were pushed down the social hierarchy to being equivalent to prostitutes. In fact, the word Devadasi in Tamil is Devar Adiyal, the one who is surrendered to the god. And you know what Thevadiyal in Tamil means? Thevadiyal is, we call somebody a Thevadiyal, is a bastard. So see how the change of that meaning of that word is emblematic of change of what happens to those people and their location in society. So Devar Adiyal becomes Thevadiyal, as an abuse word, right? So, if you take body, this art form is entirely then appropriated by Brahmin women in the early 20th century. They have defined the idea of the body. They have defined the idea of movement, idea of what is within quotes vulgar, what is not vulgar, to the extent that today Bharatanatyam is a symbol of this country. The old word Sadir is lost, right? So this is a constant process of appropriation that is happening. It is both intellectual and physical, and here body shapes are also being determined. What is an ideal woman's body is also being determined, So, and all this is determined within this notion of caste and built within this notion of caste.
This is a very, and I think this will open many, and one of the things I was observing, because body is so central, and the shape of the body and the way it is represented, of especially a male gaze on a woman.
Absolutely.
To satisfy the erotic desire or the unattained, right? And I have been observing this for some time through the canonical texts. And one of the things I found was, so there is always this, there is an idea of Apsara in the heaven, where Vishnu or Indra overlooking.
Correct.
And I always wondered, what caste is Apsara? Because who is performing?
Correct.
And then Apsara is condemned in the texts as someone who is there to bhang or trying to take away the devotion of gods.
Correct.
Right. And so the heavenly pleasures that are offered in the at least in some Hinduized canon of Apsaras being yours, you have access to Apsaras, and they perform. That similarly was told, for example, in an Islamic context, when you die, you will get certain, heaven in virgins. So,
yes.
In fact, nobody is, in a way, we can't really justify that thinking in either of canons.
Correct.
My interest is, who are those virgins? And what social location do they come from? Will those virgins or will those apsaras be the relatives or coming from the descendants of kings, or the ruling class, or in this case the Brahmin class?
I mean, I think the no-brainer is no. Sorry. Sorry, go ahead.
No. Go,
no, I'm saying that because the whole notion of that these women are there to please the needs of people of social power, right? Even if you're a god of social power. In fact, the power of the god is also part of social hierarchy. So if you look at how gods have power and who has more power, it works within a hierarchical system in that power landscape, right? And the access to this pleasure the access to this pleasure. And what are these apsaras supposed to be good at? Music and dance.
Yeah.
Okay, and also the fact that you say take music and dance as being ways by which you capture the mind of these powerful men. This entire power operation that is there is definitely indicative of the fact that they can't belong to, within quotes, the respectable women caste.
That's right.
Because they can't be, they are not people who are going to allow themselves to be used in the body in that sense.
And so this is what I was thinking, and I was trying to theorize the art of the polluted. And in this case, it's very essential, right? And you have really pointed out on the aspect of pollution and purity, especially when it comes to mridangam and the kind of hide that we use. And then I was thinking, is there a space for an appreciation of the art of the polluted by, and I call them the purist charlatans, because of their own purity complex.
Correct.
And I think this fear, and this is what I want to I think the art of the pure is a statement on caste society that is often reproducing its deprived self, which means your purity complex is somewhere you are deprived, and you're depriving yourself. And deprivation of what? I think it's the hunger for that high art. And the high art doesn't mean a Brahmin art or any form of high art for me. Of course, I want to subvert the notions of high art and low art. Yeah. But here, what I'm trying to understand is, if the art is created, improvised, performed, and preserved by the polluted, it doesn't get the because we live in fears. If I am a male and a female high performer, and if I can't perform in that fashion the way female is, and this is just a very generalized example, my deprived self will always be insecure of that. And so I was thinking, art has a space of at least to start with being an equalizer.
Correct. Correct.
And an equalizer of what? Human sensibilities. And when I say this, I want to argue that the art's potential is to advance in formation of one's self-protection in the carapace of tears and fears. And I'll explain this very briefly. The tears are a representative of private emotion, while fears is a political statement. And what we try to do is we try to hustle this with a political statement doesn't of course mean just a politics of India. What I mean is to have a more like for you are a political statement. But also there is a private emotion. I always wonder, Krishna, that art as an equalizer can become, and this is John Dewey talking about, through art as a self-experience. What we try to do is we try to experience someone else's emotions upon this, which then creates a huge gap because the sociality is not allowing me to experience as a Brahmin.
Okay, look, I'm just going to interrupt there. So that point you made of someone else's experience, right? Suppose we can just dig on that idea, right? So what is this notion of someone else that we are experiencing? I think because that is intrinsic to the construction of the classical. The word, the idea of the classical, or the idea of caste, upper caste culture, okay, entirely is based on this notion of somebody else's experience. Because it fundamentally functions on notions of abstract words which are coming out of mythical, out of treatises, out of some past nostalgia, right?
That's right.
Now, I'm not judging, I'm not even judging it at this point. I'm just making an academic statement, okay? Now, the question is, where am I located in that relationship is never asked, okay? So, me as Krishna singing Carnatic music, where is that space? So am I just a mouthpiece or repetitive act of recall, of re-entrenching some notion with which I actually have no relationship, right? This notion, right?
Yes,
And I'm propagating that as a community, and I'm only a pawn in the community.
That's interesting.
So what I'm actually doing is I'm creating, shall we say, pressure of pleasure. Okay, around on myself and around the community. So actually, one of the fundamental problems of having this discourse with people of caste privilege is they really do not know where they are in this experience of art.
That's beautiful.
Now, if you move away from this, that's the most astounding thing that you find. That most art forms that I would call real, okay, are entirely about that space, location, people, happening, and they don't have to be overtly political about it. It's not necessarily that they have to be Ambedkarite or making caste statement. It's not necessary, right? Even religious music. You know, when you hear the Jogapas sing, okay, the Jogapas are transgender musicians who live around Maharashtra, Karnataka border, and I have had some collaborations with them. You know, it's all religious music. It's all on their goddess who they worship, right? It's Yellamma. Yellamma is everything to them. It's Renuka. But the relationship is visceral. It is real. It is part of their everyday location, everyday happening. And it is in that there is this kind of sophistication that we don't even recognize. So, which is why there is also a reality. And the upturn of this, if I may say, is allows the upper caste to say we are not part of today's reality. We are part of this notional idea of purity. So you use this disconnection to create an intellectual high ground that you propagate. Okay, so it's this double play almost that is happening, right? And and I think it's an important thing we should explore on how this is. You know, I don't give you one example. I still, you know, Sangeeta, my wife and extraordinary musician, we were in this village near Kanchipuram. I've said this story before. And, you know, we intellectualize this idea of being in the moment in art, you know, talking about this idea of being in the moment and, you know, something happens. And, you know, we always talk about this, especially in within quotes high art. Okay. And we are there in the school of Koothu performers. And most of these performers were kids. I mean, they're like 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, boys and girls. And Rajagopal, who's the senior most artist there. And we are sitting there and we'll be having tea, chit-chatting. And he would say, okay, guys, let's do a rehearsal. And within 10 seconds, Suraj, everybody is in the moment. Everybody is there in the character. They are doing Mahabharata, okay? Everybody is there in the happening. And we look at each other and say, why is it so easy and real for these people? Okay, because you are not creating, you're not positioning the art as a representation of something else. The art is you. And that entirely changes, which is why we need to complicate experience, right? Which is what fundamentally you're also doing, which we don't do, is that art experience has to be complicated. It has to be studied with a mess.
I'll just offer a final thought on that before Shilpa, takes the question. So then how do you then train your taste buds and brain cells to welcome the art of the polluted?
Yeah.
Because that's the filthy being that is in your imagination still animates and it acts as a barrier. And so how then you will fall with love with your nightmares, the Dalit body?
Completely. I mean, I don't have an answer to your question. I can only tell you from personal experience, okay? I think that's the fundamental struggle for me or for any one of us, to very, very bluntly put. And I can, you know, how do I debaggage my habits? How do I debaggage my ideas, you know? And I can tell you it took me months and months, especially with few art forms that we have worked with through collaborations. For me, you know, it was astounding when one day what I thought was noise became music, Suraj.
Wow.
You know, and that day it was, I mean, it was honestly almost like, it was epiphany. It was unbelievable. I thought this was unmusical. And then one day, suddenly, so what happened is the question that I have to ask myself, right? So the possibility is how much can you, even if it is momentarily, engage with such acuity, with this baggage, that you pass through phases where you debaggage yourself, and then you enter a space of a possibility. And the moment you have touched it once, you know there is something far more bigger in front of you than you being closeted and stuck and saying, this is beautiful, I'll hold on to it.
That's excellent. Shilpa, this is I became rich today.
I know, Suraj, I have a question for you. I have a question for Suraj.
Sure.
Okay, so my question is, there's a question that, it's a complicated question and it's difficult. I mean, I know it's a difficult question for me to ask also. Is where in this whole debate, in this whole conversation about about affirmation of identity, about the need for challenging these notions that we are discussing, where does belief and faith, how do we locate it? Because I sometimes, and I'm being very honest here, sometimes I feel that at times, are we saying that a challenge to these notions does mean we are vacating the space of faith and religion? Because what do we do then with so many Dalits? I agree that it's come through a Brahminized world. I agree it's come through all that world. But the truth is there are many Dalits who are very full of belief and faith. So how does one locate that? My question is, how does one locate that in this struggle and in this conversation?
I think, belief is something that is the engine of this movement, within the movement of anti-caste, as well as the movement of, reclaiming your past. Belief is at a central place, but the belief of the hegemon is not. Belief of the hegemon invites you to self-hate. It derides you, and it puts you to a more contemptuous level. And that belief is something that is constantly challenged. But the power of one's faith cannot be reduced. That's why Ambedkar never gives up on the idea of religion. Many people give up. Ambedkar understands, because we have to understand the multiple religious practices change from village to village.
Exactly.
Each village has its own Kul Devata or its own village god. Yeah. And I have my friends, I don't know if it happens now, but if they get a good job, the first thing they would do is go and offer their gifts or pray to the temple in their village. Now, unfortunately, due to the Brahminization of local beliefs, caste system was introduced. And so that space of a common worship was then debarred for people. But Dalits never give up on having a faith, because their gods are the native gods. Their gods are very much working with them. That's why, for example, Velamma, the goddess, is also the goddess of the Dalits. Across, they might know with a different name.
Exactly.
And so one cannot go about proclaiming the irreason or irrationality of religion and faith in this. It is a very essential aspect, because it is spiritual, and it's not performative. You are not doing it. I went with my grandparents to a temple which was named, which was basically a Dalit god, and I knew only late, but there was an annual fair, and going there was not to go and reproduce yourself as into a superstitious faith, but it is very much connecting to your ancestors. Correct. Because if you look at the story, this is worshipping ancestors. What Brahmins do is Brahmins ask us to worship their ancestors, and that's not going to be Similarly, Dalits are not asking them Brahmins to worship Dalit ancestors. The point is, gods are eventually then juxtaposed with, unfortunately in India at least, with caste system, and caste just becomes a carrier, a vehicle. So I am more a person who would give more attention to the faith-based syllogisms of Dalits, as well as the people who don't want to have any faith, because it's not a competition, it's not a communism, it's not an idea of promoting a certain ethic only. We have multiple ethics, and our individuated ethics need to be preserved. That's why the saffron, the Buddha's saffron, unfortunately becomes Hindutva saffron, which needs to be challenged. And this can be challenged not by stepping out of the canon, but by being in the canon and giving it a response. And that's why I am welcoming people who are Hindus, but who want to challenge the Brahminic order within that. And not just offer lip service, but be very extremely convinced about the fact that without this, and believe me, the black church did that. The reason we have black church is because the white clergy denounced the
Suraj,
idea of what...
Narayana Guru is also an example. From
I mean, absolutely. You know, why would Narayana Guru then become relevant for a Bahujan struggle? Is for the very fact that his faith is intact and we can utilize. So what we want to do very pragmatically, Krishna, is we would like to utilize, because see, people's faith is not going to go away.
Yeah.
And even if it goes away, it will go away for themselves. What we need to utilize is the nucleus of this energy, which is a community-based worship.
Beautiful.
A sensibility of shared vulnerability. If we come across, for a worship, what we do is we let our emotions play. We let our goosebumps decide how are we going to react to a certain mantra or certain reciting of certain verses. And that's why we have to find, there is a difference between a Brahmin worship, a Dalit worship, Adivasi worship. We have different, even Khatris and other caste worships. We need to uphold that. And the people on the hegemon need to not take the stick and improvise for them for their good. Because if you don't do it, then we're going to make us more saffrons, which is again going to be misappropriation.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. I love the expression nucleus of the energy. I'm going to plagiarize you.
Indeed, indeed.
Thank you both. This is wonderful, but we have a growing list of questions and we're already at 7. So I'm just going to narrow it down to 2 themes that I see repeating in a lot of the questions. And I'm going to ask you to, unfortunately, keep it quite short with your responses. So I'll throw open both questions to both of you. One which is to do with the intersections with religion, which I think is related to what you were just talking about, Suraj, generally with faith. So a couple of different audience members have asked specifically about Muslims in Hindustani music, or the example of Yesudas and him being Christian and things like that. So where the intersection of religion and caste really comes to play within how art forms are consumed or even disseminated, all of that.
Suraj, you want to go?
So you go ahead. I'll go later.
So, I mean, you must first understand why. I would first ask the question, why are we asking that question? Because it's always important to wonder, why is that coming to my head? Why is that idea, me wanting to, I'm not putting this on the questioner, but if I ask the question, I would think of that of myself. That we immediately want to think of 2 Muslim names or 1 Christian name and say, why are we doing this? What are we trying to protect by doing this? I think it's something that needs introspection because it is a reflexive happening. So let's think about it. Now, keeping that aside, there is a fundamental problem here, whether it is Hindustani music or Carnatic music. If you are a person of Islamic faith in these 2 systems, you have fundamental, or even if you're a Christian, you have to kind of agree to a foundational notion of the Brahmins' idea of Hindu, Nada, everything else, Upanishad, Vedas, everything. You may not even believe it, you may not practice it. Can you think of an Islamic musician who would say, I completely disagree with Hinduism, Hindu gods, I think Rama doesn't exist, but I will sing this music. You think he'll be accepted? Let's think about it. So there is either a silent acceptance or let's not talk about this. That is definitely something that is automatically pressurized on these people. Secondly, why are we calling out these names? To prove that we are Catholic? Is that why we are saying this? Then why is there a problem if a Hindu musician sings a song on Allah? I mean, I am a person who faced it, so I know what I'm talking about. You sing on Jesus, there is a problem, and you're considered to be part of the conversion crowd. I mean, this is problematic. So I'm saying that even the relationship that we have, I mean, we have some incredible musicians from the Islamic faith, from Muslims, from Christians, no doubt. And this is not any way a reflection of them. But I think we need to be a little more careful about this relationship, that somewhere below that relationship lies these notions that we refuse to shake out. And we are constantly using these people possibly to prove something about ourselves, rather than actually having a respectful, equal, diverse relationship. And I think that is something we should think about deeply. I mean, I hear people saying Yesudas always goes to Guruvayur. Why do I care a damn whether he goes to Guruvayur or not? Why is that even a statement being made? You know, why?
Okay,
So I think, you know,
I'm going to ask you to sort of give in your thoughts before we move to the next question.
I mean, I just want to excuse me. The point is, I think when we identify, and I think Krishna is hitting right on the head of this kind of excusing, dragging the feet, kind of on its not leaving the position. I think even if you are identifying the Christian or Muslims, we still have to pay attention to how caste dynamics play in this form. We have, of course, embraced the Christian and as well as the Muslim participant in this, but the Buddhist art and aesthetic is still very much, not part of a conversation. And people, I don't even know about the richness of Buddhist ethics and art forms. And I think that is a huge topic of excavation. In fact, even I think in Mahayana tradition, there is a lot from India that goes to be practiced in those part and traditions. So I want all us to, kind of also reflect on the Buddhist art and aesthetics and how they inform and how they, of course, also challenge some of our notions that we are trying to, innovate in our practicing art form.
I'm going to pose this question to you first, Suraj.
Okay.
Zinia has asked, do you think it's possible to understand, learn, and participate in, within quotes, the art of the polluted without appropriating it as an upper caste person? And I'm just combining with this another question from an anonymous attendee who's basically said, what is the sort of role of non-Dalit performers and trainers when it comes to what are classically Dalit art forms? Or what you see as what could be their role without it being...
So Right. So one of the things is, do we know what are classic Dalit art forms? The reason we state is because there has not much enough research and writing that's happened there. If you read Dalit stories, autobiographies, memoirs, and of course the ethnographies of Dalit livelihood, especially and anthropologists have done good work, you will see how the rhythmic appreciation is rooted in the nativization of their existence. It's quite a, and that's why the art as experience, self-experience, is very fundamental to how I interpret whatever I have to do with art form. And that's why, because we do not yet know the synthesis, like we know the soul's music was created by slaves when they were harassed and denigrated on the plantation sites. They mixed the African musicality and tonality to produce something newer art form that is, of course, widely consumed by the rest of the world. How then we also think about this Dalit art forms? And if you ask me, Dalit art form is everyday appropriated by the classical people, because that's essentially an art form of the people, of the suppressed, of the lowest. We have not given them due credit. I'll tell you, there is a community in Maharashtra that I know of, who is called Matang, who is basically, perform Halgi. Halgi is almost equivalent of Parai. And, their music form is most important to a certain gods in certain rituals, but yet, they are kind of, but then that becomes modernized, or that becomes appropriated by Brahmins and then performed. So a simple question is, ask how many of these classical art forms that we are talking about has origins of Brahmins' innovation or the labor of the underclass. And then maybe we will have a more nuanced reply to that.
Yeah. I'm just going to add one thing to it. When we discuss culture and arts of especially communities that are marginalized, Dalit communities, one of the fundamental things is that in the notion of being progressive, I think the first thing is what are those art forms? What are we actually talking? We're not talking about art, right? We're only talking about people. We're talking about people, communities, and we're talking about this, their nature and their situation in society and oppression. So I think what a non-Dalit can do is enable that voice and that art form to grow. Okay. So, but it's tricky. I will concede it's tricky. I concede that I probably will make mistakes. Okay. Let's first start from a position of saying I'm going to make mistakes in this relationship, because it is a complicated relationship. I don't know. I think the first thing non-Dalits who are engaging can start by saying is, I don't know. And I will never know. I will continue learning. So the one thing is, do not learn the art form. Let me say it bluntly. Do not learn the art form. What you need to do is enable that art form and that community to find places, find stages, find locations where they can be heard. Now, let me just problematize my own relationship here. So I do collaborations, but they are tricky situations, because even in collaborations, the reality is the unevenness of both of our locations. So how do we create why do I do the collaboration? You could ask me that question. Because I think it's a conversation that allows for multiple kinds of people to view this relationship, to view multiple art forms. But our locations are still uneven, aren't they? So how do I then problematize even the performance? Can I do that? Can the performance itself be problematized in the fashion to say, boss, there is a problem here? So that is something we try. For example, we do a Carnatic Koothu. We do this performance called Carnatic Koothu. In between two scenes that we do, in which we are just orchestra along with the Koothu orchestra, we do a conversation between Rajagopal sir and me, where we talk about caste, language, form, and art forms. And we take positions and through music kind of are contesting each other. And we explain it to the audience. Not that we have resolved anything there. Not that we have said we are friends and we are hugging and kissing. No, to say that there is a mess here and we are grappling with it. I think that honesty and integrity is all we can hold on to and try to keep pegging along, because the conversation is still important.
All right, so we are at 7:10 and I'm conscious that there are several more questions. So what I'm going to do is just close with one last question to both of you, which I'm just going to paraphrase from one of the audience questions and ask if you can reiterate what one thing, just one thing, that you think museums, theaters, or music venues, basically cultural spaces, can do practically to help sort of create a more equal arts scene or sector. So I'm going to start with you, Suraj.
I think that's the theme of today's conversation.
Yes, so one would be your closing statement here.
That's the inclusion and and equity. We need to populate and we need to commission more Dalit artists in various art forms and try to appreciate their art, because Dalits, it's not that they don't have audience, they do have audience. It's just that they don't get appreciation, and we need patrons to commission more of such works and let Dalit art form enrich us. Right now, it's a garlic-less curry, which is not very much fun. We need to add more element to our taste buds, and also
Suraj,
that will help.
It's also some mutton and beef.
Indeed, I mean that's my favorite. That's my ancestral cuisine. Now that you remind me, I have to go and pay respects to my ancestors now by cooking some of that. But what we need is the museums, the coming up museums, as well as the theaters, as well as orchestras and music forms. What we need to do is we need to enrich our lives by having this, so our next generation, our kids, can more fundamentally alter, or else it's going to be the same repetition, as Krishna was saying, talking about something very fictitious, not really related to it, but just kind of repeating that constantly and trying to fit it. It's just difficult. And let's share our flesh, share our blood with Dalit artists. Let us sit next to each other and let's appreciate it. And that's what Krishna is saying, being very humble and welcoming that into space and constantly in the strife of keeping on learning. And this can also be a great benefit for otherwise near dead or dying art forms that are then confined to very few audience members with the same faces sitting in audience and who kind of appreciate to certain tones. So let's hope we will create. I want to actually create a Dalit museum that will have a section on Dalit history, but also another section on Dalit music forms and Dalit performative art. And art, as I said, is an equalizer. And if Krishna's tune can hit me, I'm sure Suraj's tune can also hit you. So let's open that as well.
Brilliant. Krishna, your closing comment on
my answer would be directed towards the Savarnas directly. Subvert all ideas of the people, subvert the spaces of the people, subvert the forms of the people. And the people here I'm directly talking about are people who have constructed the notion of high art, the Savarna, the Brahmins. If any space is willing to engage with this subversion, then I think you will create a complicated conversation. I'm adding on to what Suraj has already said, but I'm addressing this particularly because most museums are owned, controlled, and funded and visited by just one set of people. And you have to subvert this set in whatever way you can.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much for joining us today. This has been a fascinating and sort of extremely philosophical, sort of profound conversation. I see a lot of comments from audience members asking if a recording will be available for multiple viewings to kind of help digest some of the ideas that Suraj and Krishna have raised today. So yes, the recording will be available on YouTube on the Museum of Art and Photography's channel. And you can definitely go have a second look and forward it on to anybody you think will be interested. Suraj and Krishna, thank you both for coming on, giving us your time and so much, such profound insight. And I hope we both will, be able to host you at the museum someday as well. Everyone else who stayed on for this long, thank you so much. And we hope to see you at the next MAP Talk.
Thank you.
Gaurav, thank you as well for also staying on much longer than anticipated.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, Gaurav. Thank you, Suraj. I'm so glad we started this conversation.
Finally, after many moons.
I know. Exactly.
So thank you, MAP. We'll continue to keep fighting.
Absolutely.
Stay strong, everybody. Love you all.
Bye.
See you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.